The first morning Clara opened her eyes in her new one-room apartment in southern Oratana, the silence didn't feel empty, it felt earned. There were no heavy footsteps across the corridor, no hum of a man's shaver from the bathroom, no sounds of someone rushing off to a place where she didn't belong. Just the quiet hum of the ceiling fan spinning overhead and the rustle of tree branches brushing the window. It was strange, being in a space that bore no history, no memories to haunt her, no faint smell of betrayal hiding in the curtains. The walls were bare, the mattress sat directly on the tiled floor, and her suitcase still leaned half open against the wall. Yet, for the first time in a long while, Clara felt something close to peace. She moved slowly across the room, her bare feet cool against the floor, her body still learning how to relax without needing permission. She brewed tea in a borrowed kettle, sat by the window with chipped paint on the ledge, and watched the world unfold without her needing to chase it. Her phone was quiet, no missed calls from Raymond, no backtracking apologies, no attempts to patch up what had already bled dry. She had expected that silence might feel like punishment, but instead, it felt like healing. Even breathing was different now, like her lungs were no longer filtering through grief. The air around her was still heavy with what she had lost, but in the weight was also a strange kind of freedom, the freedom to build again without waiting for someone else to choose her. Clara spent the first few weeks rediscovering herself in small, almost invisible ways. She returned to baking, not as therapy, not as distraction, but as a quiet reconnection with the parts of her that had once brought her joy before love became labor. She found a small community kitchen that rented out oven space by the hour, and though it was noisy, humid, and far from glamorous, the warmth of it pulled her back to life. She began with just a dozen loaves of coconut bread, wrapped them in parchment and twine, and walked door to door in the business district offering samples with quiet confidence. At first, people took them with polite curiosity, unsure of this soft-spoken woman with gentle eyes and flour-dusted palms. But her bread told stories her mouth didn't need to explain. By the end of the week, she had standing orders from 3 shops and a cafe near the old train station. Her evenings were spent writing out recipes, experimenting with cassava blends, and stitching labels with her own name, Clara's Oven. It felt surreal, seeing her name take up space again, not as a second thought to someone else's plans, but as something complete in itself. The money wasn't much, but it was hers, earned without compromise, without begging for space at someone else's table. Each day layered onto the next, and soon strangers began asking about the woman who sold warm bread that tasted like memory. Clara didn't talk much about her past. She didn't need to. The way she carried herself told the world she had seen things, endured things, and come out softer, not bitter. It was this softness that made her business grow, one satisfied customer at a time. Amelia remained a steady presence in Clara's life, visiting often with bags of encouragement, sometimes in the form of groceries, sometimes just long hugs and moments of shared silence. She never pressed Clara for details about the divorce or what happened between her and Raymond, but she always made sure Clara knew she wasn't walking alone. One afternoon, as they sipped zobo under the large mango tree outside Clara's rented space, Amelia looked at her and said, "You're glowing, even though I know it still hurts." Clara had smiled faintly, brushing back strands of hair from her damp forehead. "I think I'm becoming," she replied softly, and she was. Each day wasn't perfect, but she had found rhythm in her new life, one that didn't depend on someone else's consistency. She learned how to fix her own light bulbs, bargain for vegetables in the local market without flinching, and even started a weekly delivery service for clients who couldn't make it to the shop. Word of mouth spread faster than she expected. Within 3 months, she was approached by a gentle-voiced elderly man named Mr. Adeyemi, who ran a culinary startup incubator for women in the region. He had tasted her bread at a meeting and asked if she'd consider applying for his business support program. Clara almost declined, unsure if she was ready for anything beyond survival. But something in her shifted that night. She opened her old journal, one that had remained buried beneath the rubble of her marriage, and wrote a single sentence across a fresh page. "What if I don't need anyone to believe in me before I do?" The next day she applied, and 2 weeks later she got in. While Clara was rising in quiet strides, Raymond's world was beginning to slide into disarray. What began as small inconveniences, late bill payments, missed deadlines at work, growing silence between him and Amaka, gradually twisted into something harder to ignore. The house that once felt like his kingdom now felt like an echo chamber. Amaka, once full of laughter and flirtation, became withdrawn and irritable. She no longer played the role of the eager mistress turned queen. Instead, she rolled her eyes at his stories, left plates in the sink for days, and vanished for hours without explanation. The sparkle Raymond thought he had traded stability for was dimming fast. He found himself remembering how Clara used to smooth over his chaos without needing to be asked, how her presence filled the air with calm instead of tension. Regret started as a whisper and grew into a gnawing hum in the back of his mind. He avoided mirrors because they reminded him of what he had become, a man who had thrown away a diamond because he was chasing glitter. Work became harder too. A project he had overseen fell apart due to his negligence, and rumors began circulating at the office about a possible suspension. He would sit in his car some nights, staring at his phone, thumb hovering over Clara's contact, but he never pressed call. He didn't know what to say. What could he say that wouldn't sound cheap now? He had chosen, and now he was living in the choice. But nothing could prepare him for what he would see in just a few weeks, when Clara would walk into a public event and make the entire room turn in admiration. And he, stuck on the sidelines, would come face to face with the very woman he believed would never rise again. Raymond woke up that morning to the sound of Amaka's heels clacking against the floor, her phone pressed to her ear as she laughed too loudly for someone who hadn't spoken a kind word to him in days. He stared at the ceiling, the plaster beginning to peel near the fan, and felt an ache in his chest he couldn't explain. It wasn't just about what was happening now, it was the slow erosion of everything he thought he wanted. He sat up, the sheets tangled at his feet, and looked around the room that used to feel like a reward. It was stylish, modern, filled with the kind of things he used to tell himself were signs of success: marble counters, LED lights, a walk-in closet Amaka had claimed entirely for herself. But there was no warmth here, no silence that felt safe. The air between them had become a battlefield of cold glances and quiet contempt. Amaka ended her call, glanced at him with a tired face, and said flatly, "Don't forget to pay the internet bill. It's 2 weeks late." No good morning, no affection. Just a transaction. He nodded, rubbing his eyes as she walked past him without a second look. This wasn't what he imagined when he chased excitement. There were no more candlelit dinners, no more flirty texts at work, no more stolen kisses in the car. That thrill had been devoured by reality. And Clara, he hadn't seen her, hadn't heard her voice, but her absence rang louder than Amaka's presence ever did. In his quiet moments, he caught himself wondering if Clara still wore that brown satin bonnet to sleep, or if she still hummed quietly while cooking. He missed the hum more than he missed the food. He missed the peace that never asked to be noticed. The days that followed were not kind. Raymond's job, once his pride, began to feel like a trap. He was falling behind, and the shine he once carried among colleagues had dimmed. The manager called him into a closed-door meeting and expressed concerns about performance. The word termination wasn't used, but it hovered between every sentence. Raymond left the office with a tightness in his throat and no plan for how to fix it. He drove around the city, past old places that used to mean something, where he and Clara had shared laughter, where they had bought groceries, where she once surprised him with cupcakes on his birthday. He didn't know why he was torturing himself like this. Perhaps it was the soul's way of chasing closure in places memory had made sacred. That evening, when he returned home, he found Amaka in the living room with a man he didn't recognize. A tall, sharply dressed man with a crisp accent and a watch that cost more than Raymond's monthly salary. She introduced him casually as an old friend, but the way she leaned into him, the way her laughter flowed freely, left little room for misunderstanding. Raymond didn't confront her. He didn't shout. He simply turned around, walked into the bedroom, and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor like it would explain everything. The irony stung. He had traded a woman who respected him in silence for one who disrespected him in bold daylight. He had broken something whole for something hollow, and now even the hollow was slipping from his grasp. But what haunted him most wasn't Amaka's betrayal. It was the look in Clara's eyes that last night, the way she didn't scream or curse, but instead looked at him like she was done begging to be seen. Clara, meanwhile, had stepped into her light, not loudly, but with grace that couldn't be ignored. Her bakery space was still modest, tucked into a renovated corner stall in the old shopping district, but people flocked to it like it held warmth in edible form. The glass counter displayed her pastries with quiet pride. Soft yam bread, lemon puff buns, sweet chin-chin folded into ribbons, and her signature coconut swirl rolls. Each batch was made with care, her hands steady, her eyes focused, her spirit infused into every bite. Children gathered after school with coins clutched in small palms, asking for the smiling bread, and Clara never corrected them. It was a small name, but it meant her food made people feel something, and that mattered more than awards. Her business began to catch the attention of others, local blogs, church women's groups, and eventually a lifestyle magazine that wanted to feature the woman who baked her way back to life. She turned down the first interview, unsure if she was ready to share her story. But Amelia encouraged her to see that telling the truth wasn't about opening old wounds. It was about showing the power of healing. So one quiet morning, Clara sat across from a journalist and spoke, not about Raymond, not about betrayal, but about courage, bread, faith, and the quiet power of beginning again. The article ran under the title, Rising Warmth, the woman behind Oratana's beloved loaf, and it melted hearts. Orders tripled overnight. She didn't gloat. She didn't flaunt. She just baked. Because for Clara, every loaf was no longer just bread, it was testimony in disguise. Weeks later, an event was organized to celebrate women entrepreneurs in Oratana, and Clara's name appeared on the speaker list alongside other successful women. The organizers had discovered her from the magazine feature and insisted she share her journey. Clara had hesitated, not out of fear, but out of the humility that had always grounded her. Still, Amelia persuaded her gently, saying, "Sometimes your story is someone else's permission to start again." On the day of the event, the city hall was filled with people, men in suits, women in Ankara gowns, students, and even the press. The moment Clara stepped onto the stage, something shifted. She wore a navy blue midi dress with simple gold earrings and her natural hair pulled into a bun. No makeup, just grace. Her voice was soft, measured, as she spoke about building from pain, finding your hands again, and how silence can be louder than shouting. Unbeknownst to her, Raymond sat at the back of the hall. He hadn't come to see her. He had been invited by a colleague to network and had no idea she'd be speaking. But when she took the stage, he froze. The sound of her voice, the glow in her smile, the way the crowd leaned in, he was not prepared. His hands trembled. His throat tightened. He had spent months assuming she was nursing wounds. He never imagined she'd be standing tall, celebrated, adored. She didn't see him. And even if she had, she wouldn't have blinked. In that moment, she wasn't Raymond's ex-wife. She was Clara, the woman who rose. Raymond did not remember much about the other speakers that followed after Clara left the stage. Their voices sounded like distant echoes, drowned out by the thunder that had erupted quietly inside him the moment she stood there with all that elegance, dignity, and poise. He sat at the back, still as a man carved from stone, his eyes fixed on the empty podium where she had just stood minutes ago. The applause had been loud, not polite. It wasn't the kind of clapping that came from formality. It was the kind that people gave when they felt moved, inspired, touched by something that had roots beyond the surface. Clara hadn't said anything flashy. She hadn't spoken about revenge or pain, or even hinted at what she had suffered. But in her soft, unwavering tone, there was a quiet authority. A woman who had been through the fire and emerged, not begging to be pitied, but standing in her own calm power. It hit Raymond harder than anything anyone could have said to him. He remembered how she used to avoid attention, how she preferred corners to stages, how she would fumble when asked to introduce herself in public. But today, she commanded the room without raising her voice, and she had no idea her former husband was hidden behind the last row, holding back the kind of tears that burn when they rise, not because of love still burning, but because of realization arriving too late. The crowd had rushed forward afterward, many approaching her for pictures, questions, and handshakes, while Raymond remained rooted to his seat, like a ghost at his own funeral. He slipped out of the venue once the event ended, unnoticed, his heart feeling heavier than when he had walked in. The sun had started to set, casting orange streaks across the buildings of Oratana, but Raymond saw none of it. He drove aimlessly for hours, passing by old neighborhoods, some shops now replaced, some still standing like stubborn reminders of memories he tried to bury. He didn't know where he was going until he parked in front of the old apartment he and Clara had first rented after marriage. The building looked smaller now, less significant, like most things viewed through the rearview mirror of regret. He stepped out, leaned against his car, and stared at the balcony where she once stood watering her plants. That same woman was now addressing crowds, running a thriving business, being praised in articles, and not once had she needed to mention his name to shine. That was what gnawed at him the most. She hadn't built her strength on his failure, she had simply built, period. Raymond wondered if he even deserved to feel the way he felt now. After all, hadn't he made his choices with boldness, confident that Clara would always be a quiet page in a closed chapter? He hadn't just left her, he had discarded her in pursuit of what he assumed was better. But all that glitter had dissolved, and what he was left with was a woman who no longer waited for him, who no longer cried behind closed doors, who had become a monument of grace beyond his reach. The days that followed became unbearable for Raymond. Amaka had moved out without warning, leaving behind only a single text that read, "I'm done. Good luck with your life." There were no tears, no apologies, just absence. She took nothing of sentimental value, only the things she bought with his money. The apartment felt colder now, not because she was gone, but because even her toxicity had provided enough noise to distract him from his own thoughts. Now, silence returned, but this time it didn't bring peace, it brought judgment. Every corner reminded him of what he once had and the woman he had let walk away. His work had grown colder too. The HR department had finally suspended him, citing repeated non-performance and behavioral concerns. He sat alone on the couch, the television playing on mute, with a takeout container beside him half-eaten and forgotten. He hadn't showered in 2 days. When he caught his reflection in the dark window, it shocked him. His eyes looked hollow, shoulders slumped, skin dull. This wasn't the man who had walked out on Clara with confidence. This was someone trying to remember what it felt like to be respected. In a desperate moment, he opened his phone and searched Clara's name. Her bakery page popped up instantly, beautifully curated with photos of her smiling with customers, rows of fresh loaves, comments filled with admiration and praise. He scrolled, pausing on one video where she talked about how healing is sometimes silent, but always sacred. He turned off the phone. He couldn't breathe. One Saturday, nearly 3 weeks after the event, Raymond finally convinced himself to go to Clara's bakery, not to cause a scene, but because something in him craved the closure he had never asked for. He stood across the street at first, watching through the large glass window. Clara moved gracefully behind the counter, handing out change, laughing with a young girl in a school uniform, and helping an elderly man choose between 2 loaves. She was radiant. There was no bitterness in her movements, no shadow in her smile. He wanted to walk in, say something, anything that would unlock the words stuck in his chest. But before he could cross the road, she stepped outside with a tray of freshly baked samples. Their eyes met, just for a second. Clara's smile didn't falter, but it didn't deepen either. She looked at him the way one might look at a stranger they vaguely recognize from a different lifetime. No hate, no warmth, just quiet acknowledgement. Raymond froze. He opened his mouth, then closed it. She nodded once, gently, respectfully, then turned her attention back to a waiting customer. That nod, that moment, it told him everything. She had moved on, not in a showy way, not in bitterness, just in truth. He crossed the street, not to approach her, but to pass by. As he walked by the storefront, he heard her laugh, light, easy, full. He stopped a few paces away, turned his back to the street, and let the tears come. They fell slowly, silently in public, not because he wanted her back, but because he finally understood what he had lost. and for the first time he had no one to blame but himself. The next morning came with no dramatic twist, no voice calling Clara's name in desperation. Life, as it often does, continued its quiet rhythm. She woke up to the faint sounds of Oratana's streets, hawkers shouting in the distance, motorbikes humming by, and birds wrestling over crumbs on the windowsill. There was flour on her palm before she even looked in the mirror, as if her body moved with a deeper instinct than her thoughts. She kneaded dough with steady hands, the radio playing softly in the background while sunlight poured through the window, stretching across the counter like it, too, had learned to love this space. Clara did not mention the brief encounter to Amelia when she stopped by later that afternoon. Not because it didn't matter, but because there was nothing more to say. The past had walked by her, paused, and kept going. That was enough. Closure had not come wrapped in words or confessions. It had come in the way her heart had not stirred when she saw Raymond's eyes. They were tired, searching, but no longer familiar. The man who once haunted her sleep had become a silhouette on a busy street. She didn't hate him, not anymore. If anything, she pitied him. Because while she had fought her way back to life inch by inch, he had drowned in the very water he once believed he could walk across. Forgiveness, Clara had learned, wasn't something you offered with trembling hands. It was something you lived into without needing applause. Clara's bakery flourished beyond her expectations. Within 2 months of that encounter on the sidewalk, she had signed a lease for a second location near the Riverside Market, where foot traffic never slowed. The community embraced her expansion like it was their own victory. Women she didn't know stopped her on the street to tell her how proud they were. Elderly men shook her hand with a reverence usually reserved for elders or scholars. Children called her Auntie Loaf, a nickname that made her laugh every time. And still she remained grounded. She refused to let the success numb her memory of the climb. Every month, she donated free bread to the local orphanage, and once a week, she offered baking classes to teenage girls from struggling homes, teaching them how to use their hands, their focus, their spirit to build something that could feed them. That was where Clara found her truest joy, not in profits or applause, but in creating spaces where people believed in themselves again. One Saturday, after a workshop had ended, and the girls had gone home with boxes of puff puffs and thank you notes, Clara sat alone at the window, sipping ginger tea. The sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in burnt orange and soft purple. She whispered a quiet prayer, not asking for more, but offering thanks for how far she had come. There were still nights when old wounds ached in memory, but she no longer feared them. She had become familiar with her shadows, and that familiarity had turned them harmless. Raymond, meanwhile, found himself shrinking into the edges of a life he no longer recognized. Each day blurred into the next, no job to report to, no Amaka to argue with, no Clara to comfort him. He wandered through town most mornings with a cap pulled low over his eyes, stopping at public libraries and cheap food stalls, trying to lose himself in crowds that didn't care who he used to be. Sometimes he would stand outside Clara's bakery, not out of spite or longing, but in disbelief. The life she had built stood there like a monument of quiet resilience, untouched by the storms he once believed would level her. He couldn't walk in. He never dared. What could he possibly say? That he missed her. That he realized now how wrong he had been. That his chest still tightened every time he saw her laugh with someone else. There was no room left in her world for his apology, and he knew it. His sister, who lived in a neighboring town, eventually invited him to come stay with her for a while, to clear his head, to find himself, as she put it. He agreed, not because he had hope, but because staying in Oratana had become a kind of quiet torment. Everywhere he turned, he saw evidence of Clara's triumph, and none of it had his fingerprints on it. She had outgrown him in every way, and now the very streets they once shared whispered reminders of what he had forfeited. Regret, he had come to understand, was not a shout, it was a long, silent ache. A year later, fate did not twist itself into a reunion. There was no surprise meeting at a bookstore, no dramatic turn of events. Clara's life moved forward in truth, and Raymond's shifted into quiet rebuilding. She met someone new, not a whirlwind romance, but a steady, grounded man who saw her, not as a possession or decoration, but as a force. His name was Damelaire, a soft-spoken widower who ran a printing press near her second shop. Their first conversation wasn't poetry. It was about invoices and delivery delays, but it grew gently into friendship and then into something deeper. Clara took her time, not because she feared love, but because she had learned to respect it. She told him her story, not in one sitting, but over many late walks and quiet dinners. And when he said he admired her strength, she smiled, not to impress, but because she believed him. Raymond never heard of her new life in detail. He never asked, and no one offered. He had returned to his sister's home and taken a small job fixing machines in a printing warehouse. He showed up, did his work, and returned to a room he now kept tidy. Sometimes, in the stillness of the night, he would remember the warmth of Clara's bread or the way she used to say his name with softness. But those memories no longer knocked at her door. They stayed with him, as they should, with the man who thought she'd never rise, watching from the sidelines as she built a kingdom from the ashes he left behind.